All right. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning from me. I am joining this seminar, our April 24 seminar of the International School of Radical Relations from Secwepemc Uluk in unceded, never surrendered, which is educated speak for stolen land in Secwepemc Uluk from the stewards are the Kamloops to Secwepemc here, and just so happy to be in these beautiful healing lands. I'm looking out my window, and it's a beautiful sunshiny day. So healing and so grateful to the original stewards of this land. And also to say, as I always do when we do territorial acknowledgements, it's so important to realize that it is to acknowledge that we're here on stolen land and that there is ongoing colonial violence to this day. And that what we do, our work, is also to work to decolonizing ourselves, our work, our institutions, our communities. So, welcome everyone here today. We have four speakers. We're going to start with Kevin Namey from the Laval University. Then we're going to move on to Alison Starkey from University of Toronto. Then Neha Singh from UBCO. And finally, Ayo Ul Ulthin from Toronto Metropolitan University. I hope I pronounced names correctly. And I'm going to invite each speaker to do a territorial acknowledgement and then take it away. I will let you know when there's like a minute left for you to you just I'll do a little chat there so that people know. And so, without any further ado, let's welcome Kevin with his talk here today. Will you present your topic, Kevin, and yourself?
I will do. Thank you, Monica. So I am in Quebec City at Université Laval in Quebec City, which is on the unceded territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Cree. There's multiple regions here, and indeed working hard for decolonization in this territory as well. Um, I will say in my talk, I have some slides. In our group meeting, we were talking about how to align and coordinate. And given that I have presented variants of the type of argument that I've already posed for this paper, I decided in my talk to focus more on fundamental concepts that seemed to emerge throughout the four of our conversations, and maybe that also could provide some seeds that maybe could be picked up in a few further conversations. So, what I'm going to present today, it is my topic, but it's my topic from the point of view of a certain set of core concepts that characterize relational sociology, at least in the way that we seem to be conjointedly engaging with those concepts. And so I will just share my screen if that's okay. I don't know if that poses any issues. I am Yes, is that right? Uh,
Yeah, I can see it.
yeah, okay. Then let's do that. And so right. And so in what I prepared for today, obviously my topic is about this concept of educational creation, which is something that has emerged out of my dissertation work in my doctorate now many years ago, and which I've sort of been working on and developing piecemeal to try and draw out some of its ramifications. Today, what I wanted to really look at in this presentation is the relationship between relational conceptions of creativity and social change. And to do that, I'm going to look at first at questions of relational ontology and how creativity features in a relational ontological perspective, and some of the core ideas that come with that. Flattening ontologies, what does it mean to have a flat ontology, and notions of animacy and material agency, the relationship between the human and the non-human as it pertains to, in my work, creativity. But I think that this is something that will come up in multiple presentations today. And then I'm going to end with reflection on more the elements of my paper that thinks about questions of justice and questions of creativity as they are connected to these ideas of relational ontologies and relational perspectives. So in previous presentations on this topic, I presented more the actual ideas. Here I'm presenting more some of the philosophical premises and that sort of found what I'm arguing for in my work. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the presentation that I'm doing here is that to start with, when you talk about creativity, there is a general sense in which creativity is understood as a thing, a talent, a skill, an ability of some kind. It's what it ends up happening is we often treat creativity, at least in conventional discourse, as this person is creative or this person is not so creative, and it's this sort of measure of a capacity. And the work that I do and the work that I did in my dissertation is really drawing on relational perspectives to think about creativity as a much more fundamental relationship and a much more fundamental way of being and a way of living and way of thinking and way of understanding the world. And so, in the view that I'm proposing, creativity is it's a ubiquitous part of relational entanglements and being part of the world. And so there's a real displacement here from creativity as a concept centered on talent, ability, or skill to creativity as something that is always ongoing and taking place, in which we then partake of and we participate in, not simply as the agents of it, but as also recipients of creative force. And so this idea is very much stems directly out of a relational ontology. And so moving from a world of things to a world of processes uh, ends up pushing us quite immediately towards questions of how does the world become and how does that becoming take a change and transformation taking place. And so the question of transformation from a relational ontology is one of the essential questions because the question is, well, are these changes happening? When you're living in a world of relational processes, there is no real stasis, and in a way that sort of runs up against our ontologies of our static ontologies that treat the world as composed of categories and things and objects. Relational theories obviously end up driving us towards, well, what are the mechanisms that lead towards these changes? And so this is sort of ties into this notion of the ontological turn that Spirou talks about in his work. And the way he frames this ontological turn is that it is not concerned with essences, as in most traditional discussions of ontology or in philosophy, but with what things are and what they could become as a result of their relational encounters with the world, entities, and in this way, entities do not pre-exist their relations. And so a relational theory sort of rather quickly brings us to the question of what does it mean to become? How does becoming take place? And how do those becoming processes shape the way we live and the way we think? And so my work really centers on that kind of question. What does it mean in the context of education and more generally to be a participant in the processes of becoming? The way I frame that in my work is through world making and other concepts. But at the core, the relationship is really at the heart of this. And so the argument that I propose is that relational ontologies require us to rethink creativity at a very paradigmatic level as part of a world in constant movement, change, and that is endlessly creative. And so, in that way, it sort of moves us towards a way of thinking about creativity that is really a confrontation with the divide between the human and the non-human, which we're going to see in one of the next slides. So these relational ontologies propose, generally speaking, what could be called a flat version of ontology, which means that the idea here is that we are trying to understand causal force, not necessarily in terms of their hierarchical relations among nesting orders. The idea with general ontology, I think, is based on the idea that there is an order of hierarchy in the world. With hierarchical ontologies, what you have is for example, causal force stems from higher orders, and lower orders are controlled by the higher orders. And in general, in the relationship between the human and the non-human, that hierarchical order the human is situated on the top of that ontology. And so there's an ontological way of thinking about the world where human beings are the agents of the world because human beings make choices that then compound in lower level orders. A flat ontology is one that seeks to remove that assumption, that normative assumption, that the relationship between different realms or orders are simply one of hierarchical and causal relationship. And by doing that, it also sort of pushes us towards a way of thinking about the world and the world becoming, where the human being is situated more on a plane of also being shaped as opposed to simply shaping. And this is sort of then it ends up confronting with all of these theories of mind, for example, and even when we talk about extended cognition, it's a version of, well, the world is an extension of human cognition because, and so this really is starting this way of thinking about flattening ontology. The question is, well, how do we understand the world not simply as a space of human doing, but as actually part of the force that shapes the human, just as the human shapes the world. And so there's this dynamism in that way of thinking about uh, flattening ontologies. And so uh, from this point of view, relational ontologies presume that the world is animate, obviously, and that it cannot simply be understood as the backdrop or a context upon which human beings do the acting. And so one of the ideas here is that when humans act, matter acts back. And this is one of these core concepts that comes through Karen Barrett's agential realism, but also in the context of Pickering's work and other thinkers like Malafouris. And so it's this idea that led me really to the concept of creativity as a type of relational engagement. Um, that creativity, by in this way of thinking, creativity is always a form of collaborative entanglement. It's never simply a doing on a material. It's never simply an action upon. It's always an action and a reaction. And that relationship ends up being really essential to understanding how creation takes place. And in the context of some of the work that I've done, it's to understand that human action always takes place in contexts of material and discursive constraint, that we act in worlds that are not made by us and that shape us as well. And so, what this is one of these ideas that comes with, I think, how I'm trying to approach relational conceptions of creativity. I'm almost done. I have only a few more slides. It's short time. We had 10 minutes or 12 minutes. Is that it? Sorry, my
I'm gonna
bad. I
say
didn't.
12 to 15, so
Oh,
we're
okay,
good.
okay.
We're good.
Yeah,
We're
we're
good.
good. I'm good. I have maybe 4 or 5 more slides then. And so ultimately, the argument that I wanted to propose in my paper is that a transformative notion of social justice needs to contend with processes of creation. And in some respects, and in many respects throughout sociology, we do contend with these processes, but we don't do it through concepts of creativity. We do it generally in a way that I think is much more attuned to the kind of constraints that people face through structures and the shaping practices. And so creativity in the sociological tradition is something that we see, for example, in concepts such as agency and reflexivity, reflexivity being one of these tools that we use to expand our ability to act. And to in that way also to create. It's one of these core concepts in the neo-pragmatist tradition of Dewey and Mead and the symbolic interactionists. I think there are elements of this creative notion in the way that Marx thinks about production. And also with critical pedagogy and critical consciousness and Paulo Freire's work, there are many, many others that I could have included here. For example, with feminist philosophers, there's an extensive work on this way of thinking. Bell Hooks, other examples I've given with Heckman and the material feminisms and other things. These ideas, I think, sort of um, relate to a many, many different ways, different concepts. But one of the core elements of a sociological way of thinking about creativity is that it is not a pure and complete autonomy of the individual. Creativity and the creative action that takes place is always a form of action that takes place in a relational context of constraint. And so one of the things that sociology does bring to these conversations is it brings an understanding of the fact that creativity, well, it's always a mitigated creativity. It's a creativity that comes through the context of how we are shaped and how we are being shaped by society. Another example of this is the concept of habitus that Bourdieu proposes, which Bourdieu has always argued is a concept that is tied to generativity. although people see it as predominantly determinist. But that's not he countered that extensively, but wasn't necessarily accepted. And so, in the work that I do, then the idea that I propose is the concept of educational creation. And the reason I call it that is because at the heart of all learning processes, all educational process, I argue, uh, is this relationship with the world. It's not just an internalizing process, it's also a creation process. Through learning, we are also making. And so there's a type of adaptive relationship in the context of learning that we tend to not see because our models of learning are predominantly based on transmission and not on this dynamic relationship that is at the heart of the way in which people live and act in social space. Um, and so, in a way, the argument that I'm proposing is that at the heart of educational processes, we have to understand how it's not just that we take in knowledge, but in taking it in, we change it, we adapt it, we shape it. And I think that in some respects, it could be argued that this is one of these mechanisms that is actually part of social construction and the processes of transformation that we do see take place in the world that tend to be misunderstood for many different reasons. Um, and so I think that when you think about this aspect, about education, not simply as transmission, but as this relationship, as a material discursive entanglement or engagement, it leads to a way of thinking of the educational process, not just as as a form of creation, but also as a form of ethical practice. That there are ethical and normative choices that are made in the way we think about knowledge and knowledge work that have a real bearing on the shape of society, both short and long term. And so the ultimately, this idea of learning that I'm proposing uh, requires us to rethink the nature of educational process and more fundamentally between learning and change. The way that we think about social transformation, we tend to think, I think, about schools in general, depending on the context, but schools are often places where students are removed from the public sphere. They're put into spaces that are a little bit more controlled, and the goal of education today, as we see it, is about acquiring knowledge that has already been decided upon for the students. And the argument that I'm proposing is that that's a mistake because what it does is it reduces those spaces to spaces of acquisition, whereas in reality, I think there is much more a relational entanglement taking place in the classroom that needs to be given its proper place. Um, and that relational entanglement is part of piecemeal processes of social transformation. Um, uh, and so the question of knowledge transfer ends up featuring, I presented this in one of my previous talks. The question, the way we prioritize the transfer of knowledge ends up, I think, undermining how creative that process actually is, both creating people and shaping them through socialization, but also creating knowledge and material discursive realities and reshaping material discursive reality. And so it's the dual process. It's not just that we change society, we change people and people change society. And then there's that loop that is always taking place between uh, people and environment, or there are many different ways of describing that relationship. And so this is my last
We're at
slide.
time. Okay.
Yeah, my last slide here. So in mobilizing a flat ontology, this way of thinking really has us think, invites us to think differently about the kinds of transformative work that are actually already taking place in the classroom and in the environment, in educational environments. That's it. We could end it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin, for this amazing presentation. We have our next speaker is Alison Starkey from University of Toronto. Are you sharing slides, Alison, or uh, the talk is entitled Poison Pill. Well, we see the slides. A relational sociology of gendered racialized women retail pharmacists in Ontario. There we
Okay,
have it.
can you tell me what you see? Can you see just my slides or are you seeing everything?
Everything.
Okay, let me go back in and I just want to.
I could see your slides if you start them. Like the slides were visible.
Okay, but was it just the slides or are you seeing like my comments underneath and things like that?
I think so.
Okay.
Your comments, it's your
The
presentation view.
whole thing. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think so. Yeah.
Not the presentation.
You,
Um,
you
It was
just
a bit quick.
you just needed to full screen it.
I needed to full screen it. Okay.
Yeah, I
So
think so.
content only and then full screen it. Okay. All righty.
There you go.
All right. So my my chapter is going to build off of a presentation that I gave last year called Poison Pill, a Relational Sociology of Gendered Racialized Women Retail Pharmacists in Southern Ontario, Canada. And last year, I ended up the talk with looking at Powell's guidelines for radical relationism and running through everything as it applies to my participants, gendered racialized female pharmacists. And I thought that the central argument for my chapter could be looking at the object, which is workplace violence, which comes out of relations between people, but looking at this last one here, treating the macro and micro as relative, not separate. This is my general presentation outline. I'm going to be introducing it, the who, the why, preliminary findings, and then what within the pharmacy profession, how I've been doing it, and then digging deeper into the preliminary findings, and then wrapping up. Um, so I am presenting from Takaranto, Toronto, and I just want to acknowledge that it's my responsibility to do the unlearning and the learning and engaging with histories and traumas in which I am implicated, both in my scholarly work as well as in my professional work working in retail pharmacies, and that I'm a treaty person and sort of if you can use the word governed by the dish with one spoon wampum, which is a mutual invocation to protect the land and its resources and to share those resources among and within our community. But I'm also implicated in histories of involuntary enslavement, migration, stolen labor, which has been used to build communities on stolen land, as well as on treaty lands, and that this ongoing legacy of translocal and transhistorical trauma continues to impact many living communities who continue to struggle. And it persists in our policies and processes that continue to exploit the hearts, minds, bodies, talent, skill, and hard work of many gendered racialized individuals, from our farming and food production to our healthcare infrastructure. And the reason why I'm going into this kind of acknowledgement is because of the context of my research as a researcher doing workplace violence. I work to be mindful that I'm white, that I'm middle-aged, that I'm working class, that I'm a first-generation settler, that I'm an unlicensed, non-professional. I'm not a pharmacist. I'm an assistant or a technician. I'm a coworker. By some, I could be perceived as a subordinate. I was trained on the job. I have 15 years of experience. I've worked with many pharmacists in both independent and corporate environments, and so I'm kind of what Dorothy Smith would call an insider-outsider. Looking at the experiences of workplace violence from the front lines of Southern Ontario retail pharmacy settings. This is my pharmacy where I work on a daily basis. This is what you would see as a patient or a customer coming into my store. I work at the far end. And the reason why I'm studying workplace violence and healthcare and in pharmacy in particular is because I've seen workplace violence from day one in my time in pharmacies. It is a growing global phenomena. And of those who regularly experience it, 55% felt less motivated, more dissatisfied with their jobs, and 25% expressed a willingness to quit. 48% of polled pharmacists indicate they wanted to or were thinking of leaving the profession. Um, and this has implications on a whole host of things, which I'll get into in a minute. So workplace violence in healthcare has no uniform definition, but it includes threats, mobbing, bullying, any behavior that humiliates, degrades, or damages a person's well-being, value, and dignity, which is very vague. It includes, but is not limited to, verbal abuse, intimidation, physical injuries experienced while fulfilling duties, the witnessing of workplace violence, as well as a fear of potential workplace violence, both experienced and witnessed, and near misses. And workplace violence impacts a whole host of things, not just in the Southern Ontario retail environment, but across Canada and globally. It affects recruitment, training, workplace integration, post-licensing skill development, mentoring, services and quality of patient care, work trajectories, so people's entire lives, worker retention, stratification, social determinants of health and health disparities, both behind and in front of the dispensary bench, interprofessional collaboration, so collaboration between pharmacists and nurses, pharmacists and doctors, and a whole host of other allied healthcare professions. Organizational and institutional management strategies, not just within retail environments, but also at the governmental level at the hospital level, at healthcare hubs, clinics, you name it. Interprovincial licensing, workforce allocation, migration policies and strategies, immigration policies and strategies, which is a big black box, and public health policies and responses to chronic diseases, disease clusters, infectious disease outbreaks, and pandemics. So my preliminary results are my participants have given evidence of verbal abuse, threats and intimidation, both verbal and physical, bullying, both from patients, from customers, from coworkers, from regional directors, and from head offices. They've witnessed workplace violence against their coworkers, against patients, against customers. They've experienced sexual harassment, both in public and in private areas, like when they're counseling patients or when they're giving flu shots or COVID shots, vaccinations. They've experienced assault. They've been robbed at gunpoint and with other weapons. They've experienced near misses. There's a lot of fear in the profession of potential workplace violence, of retribution, and the retribution comes not just from patients and customers, but also from coworkers and from their managers, regionals, and head offices, and also fear of frivolous investigations. So why setting all of this up, looking at the pharmacy profession in Ontario, at least 68% of pharmacists work in retail community pharmacies. And this is of note because of the downloading of healthcare services and responsibilities from the public sector onto the private sector into retail pharmacies, and vaccinations, flu shots, COVID shots, things like that are one of many of those downloading of responsibilities that we see. Of note, 58% of pharmacists are women, 52% are internationally trained. So immigration policies, who we bring into not only Ontario, but into Canada to do this work, and how they get to do this work once they're here. So given these demographics and that gender is always race and race is always gendered, how does seeing workplace violence take on new meanings? Because within the profession, there's this idea that workplace violence is just part of the job, that it's not a problem, it's just part of the job, it's just something that we have to suck up and deal with. So reiterating racialized gendering and gendered racialization, that race is always gendered and gendered is always race. That's why I'm looking at gendered racialized female pharmacists in this environment. And I'll go into this in my chapter a little bit more, but we don't really have a lot of time. So how to study the conditions of work that are the conditions of care. And how I have chosen to do this is to take a broad umbrella framework, which is pharmacist emotion practice, in order to drill down into what's really happening for pharmacists. Because when I would talk to them and I ask them, like, okay, that was a really crunchy experience. Like, what's going on for you there? Do you think of that as emotion work? Do you think of it as emotional labor? And it was neither of those things. It was both and neither at the same time. And sort of like, okay, what does that look like? And what does that mean for them? So emotion practice, the three pillar or three foundations of it are emotion as practice, as effort, and as energy. So emotion as practice applies Bourdieu's practice theory to emotions, and it originates from historian Monique Scheer when she looked at our emotions practices, and is that why they have a history? Because emotions, how we perceive emotions has changed through time, and that's evident in the historical record. Emotion as effort used in individual acts of emotion management, which expands and resituates Arlie Hochschild's emotion management theories. And then emotion as energy to be shared or conserved, which taps into work inspired by Randall Collins's interaction ritual theory. And the reason why I'm using this framework as well is because across the literature, there are a lot of empirical differences that and there's a lot of problems with like expressing, what's happening in this field and then comparing it to a different context, which depends and is inflected by somebody's social location as well as who they're interacting with. I'm also applying Gunnar double research method, which is working with and against stereotypes, looking at insecurities of meaning, where people sort of struggle to talk about things or are grasping for the words, the vocabulary, the ways to describe things. Um, Typically in dispensaries, you're looking at people think of just the pharmacist and maybe the assistant and maybe the cashier, but the reality is something much more complex, which involves all of these different pathways, and it's something that I will be dedicating a little bit of time to in my chapter. We don't have a lot of time here. I just wanted you to get an idea of when you walk into a pharmacy, you see the pharmacist, and maybe you see one other person, but the reality is something very, very different, and it's actually quite complex. And the relational dynamics sort of both create, inspire, and uh, influence the workplace violence that occurs. Um, so I won't have time to go into this, but this is one of the examples of epistemic violence that happens quite commonly, where even though somebody is wearing the white jacket, they're clearly wearing a name tag that says that they're the pharmacist, and but their knowledge is completely denied, and the person will go to the white male or me, who's clearly not a pharmacist, and ask for reiteration of what the pharmacist has said. So when studying the conditions of work that are the conditions of care and interrogating pharmacists' emotion practice while employing Gurner doubled research as an analytical tool, what am I actually looking for? And when I'm looking for the macro in the micro and the micro in the macro. And basically, I'm looking for synergies and disjunctures. So what I thought I would do in my chapter was look at two interactions that I had with my participants. The first one I'll go into in a minute. But this idea, I've been told that I need to contextualize and that my participants' experiences are only relevant within the micro context of the Southern Ontario retail environment. But that's not what I experience. And that's not what my pharmacists experience. We experience back orders that arise out of things that happen in other parts of the world, influencing workplace violence in the here and now. So looking at the violence on the micro, meso, and macro continuum, I'm looking at integrative interpolations, excuse me, where the work of coping is with this workplace violence is being done by an agentic pharmacist, and the work of coping is required by the object, the experience of workplace violence, and is constituted in and by the relationalities occurring in retail dispensaries. So between the pharmacist and the patient, pharmacist and their coworker, or a technician like myself, or perhaps another pharmacist, or a doctor, or a regional director, and that these relationalities occur locally, so in the dispensary, but also translocally and transhistorically, and what that actually looks like. And the first example I was going to give is one of my participants, who is a gendered racialized pharmacist, was accused of being racist. You're being racist. So when we were talking about this, it was a disjuncture, both for her in describing it, and as well as for me listening to her narrative, her story. Because basically she said to this patient, like, dude, I'm a brown woman wearing a hijab, and you're accusing me of being racist. So sort of like teasing that apart and talking about that, um, and using it as a provocation, an entryway into maybe enabling potentially manipulable relational objects despite apparent durabilities, and sort of looking at the translocality of that and the transhistoricism of that in the context of the chapter. And then the second one was looking at colonialism at work, which is between the participant and myself. We were talking about her mentoring somebody, another person, and it wasn't working out. And she was trying to describe why it wasn't working out. And she was using phrases like, she just wasn't the right fit, and I that felt uncomfortable. That was a not synergistic for me. But at the same time, she said, "You know what I mean?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." And sort of looking at that, that the synergies expressed were expressive of colonial processes or practices, rules and norms that also are potentially points of intervention for manipulable relational objects, despite, again, apparent durabilities. So sorry, I'll have to speed up. So then I would reiterate the guidelines for radical relationalism and sort of bring in, as Kevin was talking about, the sort of the micro and the macro and the macro and the micro, and how relationalities inform the social organization of retail pharmacies and healthcare systems at every level, and how that impacts public health. Um, Give an example, and then talk about how the conditions of work are the conditions of care. And although I'm looking at the context of Southern Ontario retail pharmacies, it does have broader application across the board. So I will stop my share.
Thank you. Thank you
Sorry
so
for that
much,
whirlwind
Alison.
tour.
Good. Very interesting research going on. Next, we have Neha Raj Singh from UBCO. Are you sharing slides, Neha? Her
Yeah,
title is Radical Relationism and the Agency of Food.
just sharing my
Sure.
slides. Okay. Do you see it?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'm happy to be here with this panel. I've enjoyed gathering together with Alison, Kevin, and Ayo to discuss our respective work and strategies and convene. I've titled this chapter "Radical Relationality of the Land Through Food: Reclaiming Ancestral Knowledge and Relational Healing." Uh, Presently, I'm a learner on the Silk people's lands. I owe my learning and growing to their teachings, language, and ethics.
There is, Neha, a little pop-up window I think everyone's seeing right now. It's an
Oh,
audience window.
you're seeing my presenter view.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, there we go. Are you seeing it now? The presentation?
It says double click, enter full screen mode. There we are.
Oh,
Yeah.
second.
We're seeing it now, Neha.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just going to my view. Okay, yeah. So I will be presenting my research as per the following structure, beginning with my research question, relational positionality, followed by a brief discussion on theoretical framework in the context of challenges that are identified in this research, continuing on to data analysis and concluding remarks. The research question that I asked for the purposes of my master's research was, in what ways does radical relationality with land through food heal and grow communities through supporting relational worldviews? My research took a qualitative autoethnographic methodological approach. I premised this research from the perspective of my relational positionality, which is based on my colonial history, ancestral knowledge, and land based associations, which include my lived experiences of grassroots activism and collaboration with women farmers from Odisha and West Bengal in India. I did this work with the food sovereignty movement Navdanya, and important to this, my positionality is my collaboration with food sovereignty movements in the Shupapmuk region in British Columbia, in so-called
Neha, I
Canada.
think, are we still looking at your structure? We're still looking at the presentation structure slide. I wonder if you're in a further down.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
the,
no, I'm good, I'm good.
you're good there. Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Sorry.
Oh,
There we are.
I see what's happening. Now do you see it? Yeah.
Research question now.
Okay.
Oh, we're seeing everything now.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why this is happening today. I'm being betrayed.
Material agency.
No?
We're at the research question, relational positionality.
Yeah. Got it,
Okay.
got it, got it. Okay, okay, okay. No, but then can you see my screen?
Just the present slide
Okay, okay. Yes, yes.
with a
Sorry.
little birdie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I apologize, everyone. I'm so sorry for this.
Yeah, worst case, just don't do full screen and present it. Oh, now it moved. Yeah.
Now it
Yeah?
moved to
Okay,
theoretical
okay.
framework.
Okay, okay. Yeah, no, I got it, I got it.
Oh, good.
It's early in the morning. I think I'm just working overtime, I guess that's why. So yes, I talk about specifically relational positionality because my positionality has and it's constantly changing and evolving, which aligns with radical relationalism that proposes that all things are in constant change and in motion. For this chapter and in discussion, I use radical relationalism as a theoretical framework to substantiate the relational role of food in building relationships with humans, non humans, and the invisible things. I frame radical relationalism as an onto-epistemological and decolonizing theoretical framework that posits that all things are relations. Like Kevin said, that we're moving from things to process-based discussions. This framework considers relations as the main unit of analysis and social realities that follow as an outcome of relations. Central to this research was the premise that non humans, such as food and land, are actors that exercise agency by contributing to processes of transformation through their entangled relational networks. For researchers and scholars, radical relationalism emphasizes on reflexivity, as this thesis was an autoethnographic endeavor for me. As a colonized and racialized scholar, reflexivity was central to my research process. And finally, this framework draws researchers away from Cartesian dualities, ontologies, which imposes a disembodied and universal worldview in defining and producing knowledge. In contrast, radical relationalism embodies humility, focuses on interconnectedness, and is congenial to other ways of being, knowing, and living. In this discussion, I say radical relationalism challenges the Eurocentric knowledge system that has propped itself as the dominant system and is also referred to as one world by John Law. Imposed on non-European people first through colonization and continued its imposition through the experience of coloniality. Out of this system, colonizers created a vicious cycle of dominance which intersected with white supremacy, strengthened capitalism, class oppression, and created a dominant singular the world, with universal thinking that mandates all other worlds to its own conditions and has made other worlds and worldviews non existent. The same dominance was imposed on localized and situated food knowledges, plus, according to scholars like Roths, historically, food has been used as a tool of oppression and violence. Today, the understanding of food is confined by nutritional reductionism into calories and fats. Traditional ecological knowledge, cultural heritage, and cultural expressions are bastardized and appropriated by capitalism. In opposing the mono-universalized colonial narratives, I use the concept of pluriverse, which Escobar defines as a world where many worlds and realities coexist. Escobar's discourse on pluriversality in this thesis, as it inspired from certain food sovereignty movements from the global south, specifically the Zapatista food movement, which reflects my own commitment as a grassroots activist and scholar to the food sovereignty movement. And decolonial thinking from a radically relational lens requires critique of the one world, while being aware of the pluriverse and remaining committed to the continuance of the pluriverse. Decolonization implies decolonial thinking and doing through de-westernization and decoloniality and pluriversality, through which the multiplicity of ways of being, knowing, and living could be brought into re-existence. This dominant world uses substantialist thinking and scientific reduction to further its agenda and imposes narratives on other ways of knowing and being, as it states that in substantialist thinking, society, beings, entities are conceived as things that comes first and relations comes after. Parallel to substantialism is Eurocentric scientific framework that reduces the flow of life to measurable and stacked atomic building blocks and DNA chains, which is what Berard, Bohm, and Shiva talk about. This colonial projection uses scientific reductionism to subjugate violence against knowledge producers by creating a binary of experts and non-experts. Substantialist thinking and scientific reductionism are the cornerstone of the one world. This influences the narratives on food knowledges of communities, say in India in particular. And radical relationalism also challenges extractivism and the extractive logic used by colonial capitalist structures to further its project. In the colonial context, extractivism created a divide at the ontological level between beings and living things and othering people and nature. This was the othering extended to peoples other than Europeans, since the non-Europeans were considered less than human, which depicted a practice of relationality that was hierarchical and exploitative. In contrast to extractivism and othering of non-European people and nature, radical relationalism gives us the opportunity to view non-humans such as food and land as agents that could provide a sense of belonging and a logic of home. For instance, the preparation and consumption of home food could materialize the emotion of belonging. Food and land offers ways of one to heal from the separation imposed by colonization and coloniality through the ancestral knowledge of food and celebration of food festivals with family and community, all as pathways that are radically connects us people, non-humans, to the land, with the land. Food and land and people relatedness are bound by complex and entangled webs that includes all things and beings. In my research, I found, and which I hope to talk about in the chapter, that food was used as a colonial tool with a class-based agenda. The British Raj used food to master the colonized natives in choosing the British way of life, food, eating, and etiquette to divide Indian society based on class. By accepting the British lifestyle, Indians were rewarded with being acknowledged as British and therefore civilized. Scholars like Day and Mart talk about this. Colonized high caste and middle class Bengalis embraced this British perception as it appealed to their class social structure that was linked to civility and modernity, and at the same time classist biases are carried over even today. Indian food and food etiquette, much like its culture and people, faced significant disgust from the British, which was passed down to the Indian elite's social class. The British expressed their disgust in cookbooks. One in particular mentions that Indians use cloth as sieve and fingers for spoon and caution their European leaders. I quote, "The native ways are not as our ways, and the less you see of them over their cooking operations, the more appetite you will have for the food set before you. Furthermore, I have felt that I live a double life, one white and the other brown. As a metaphor, it echoes Du Bois' perception of double consciousness that refers to the two-ness of a racialized body feels when looking at ourselves through the eyes of others. I refer to the separation and fragmentation caused by the structures of colonialism and the one world narrative as an all-pervasive disease that requires healing from a systemic approach and from the root. The colonial project with capitalist agenda has extracted Indian ancestral knowledge, food and language to its own benefit. Firstly, English was used as a colonial tool. It's simplified diverse Indian foods into terms like curry, erasing the complexity and diversity of Indian cuisines through the co-option and suppression of local languages like Hindi, Punjabi, and Tamil by forceful imposition of English in India. Secondly, Eurocentric colonization shaped perceptions of Indian food, favoring some foods like achar, pickles, while rejecting others like chilies, fostering a lasting disgust towards Indian cuisine. In contemporary times, Indian food and traditional knowledge has been commodified based on whiteness and white supremacy for profit, as seen with the marketing of haldi doodh, which is golden latte. Golden latte doodh or haldi doodh is a healing drink passed down from our grandmothers. Second is the extraction of traditional knowledge through intellectual property rights, seen through the attempted patenting of turmeric, which was granted by the United States Patent and Trade Office in 1995, which was fought with the evidence by the Indian government and was successfully revoked. It became a landmark case for communities all over the world to protect their traditional knowledge from appropriation. Having discussed how food was used as a colonial tool, I also observed through this research that since food and land is a relational nexus, it simultaneously allows individuals to decolonize, heal, and find a sense of home and belonging. We can decolonize and heal by connecting with ancestral and traditional knowledge passed down families, by engaging with local food culture and festivals that are aligned with the life cycle of the land. For instance, I talk about local land-based festivals like Makar Sankranti, simply knowledge like Ritu Chakra, which is eating as per the seasonal rhythms of the earth, and reconnecting with grandmother's knowledge on food. These views complement radical relationalism's guidelines. Menachem writes about this process of healing from trauma as a relational, collective, harmonious, and symbiotic process. Further connecting with the knowledge of my ancestors have given me a place to belong and find home through the logic of home without being tied to place. I just wanted to give an example to you all about how visually an example of what a relational nexus can look like. For instance, the image on the left is an image of alpana, which is basically made out of rice paste, and it is made during festivals in Bengal, and they use rice flour specifically to express gratitude and invite birds and ants to come into this celebration. And scholars like Moritz and Sean Wilson have said that festivals are an expression of entangles between humans and non-humans. I'm hoping to be able to put these ideas and thoughts into the chapter that I will be putting across for this our book.
For this book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. Next we have Ayo, and I am looking at the time, so just take it away, Ayo. It's as you are. Do you have slides? Rituals of substantive change, vulnerability, and the relations of eating eaten. So thank you. Here we go. Is that a change of title, Ayo? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, great. Yeah, I play with titles a lot, so it sometimes is in flux until it lands in the final. So, but I guess essentially, okay, so to organize self, first I'm on the land of the Chippewa, the Rama First Nation. I grew up here. My parents were born here. My mom is Métis from the Georgian Bay Pedenatangwishing area. And I have ancestors from the Netherlands on my dad's side, and also traveling across the land as like fur traders from northern Quebec, spanning to northern Ontario, and then settling in Penetang. And my mom was one of the kids caught in the 60s scoop. My family has had multiple generations of trauma. and rather extreme poverty, targeting from the police, sort of just an marginalized existence. And so I myself have lived through constant state of violence and precarity. And as a scholar, there's a lot of challenges that I face in terms of trying to balance the fact of my ongoing precarity and vulnerability and the ongoing experience of violence that I have in my daily life. And sometimes, so I guess part of what I'm thinking and talking about is this quality of struggling with objectification and being objectified and being diminished and reduced, and having to constantly force systems to work in ways other than they were designed in order to survive them, and the complications that that creates for my relationships and my existence in these sort of places where people have no choice but to act certain ways, and that I have no choice but to challenge those ways of acting. And something that I've thought a lot about throughout my life is this idea of meatness, and the idea of our corporeality is something that is really makes us quite vulnerable. And for a lot of marginalized people, that sense of vulnerability never really stops. It's something that you just sort of learn to live with and manage. And it can create a lot of um, indeterminacy and instability in at the level of language, and at the level of determining where the boundary is of like where I am and where I stop and where other people begin, because other people and systems are always crossing that line and going over and into you and forcing you to do things and categorizing you in certain ways that are uncomfortable and that open you up to exploitation. Totally, you know, regardless of people's intent, the system itself sort of is made in this way to categorize people to become systematized and to become drawn up into like where you should be and how you should be. And a lot of that, I think, for me in my experience, is uh, creates this kind of difficulty in having stabilized meaning or having the ability to articulate myself and where I'm coming from. And so I have a lot of empathy for the experience of our food, because I have also felt like food, I think, in more than one situation. And I've also experienced quite a lot more of this sort of visceral quality of life in its breakdown. So I myself just had cancer 4 years ago and almost died. And I have a lot of consequent health issues from marginalization from my whole life, a lack of nutrition. I have a lot of breakdown in my body, and also breakdown in my ability to determine boundaries and maintain a stable sense of meaning. So that feels intense to say, but I'm trying to own it and just talk about it as a way of like helping myself, and then also helping other people to understand what it feels like to feel eaten by the situations that you're in, and to feel like you can't stop it from happening and you can't gain stability, and it's not possible to protect yourself or have a boundary. And it is a reality. It's a reality for colonized people. It's a reality for the ongoing genocide of Indigenous populations in Canada and beyond. And it is a reality for creatures of the earth who are being systematically, in a lot of ways, abused in ways that are unnecessary to happen, but that come from our categorization of them as not having feelings or being important. And part of what I'm talking about in my paper is how difficult these categories are to manage without having them leak. So if you create a category of objecthood, it's really a tool rather than an innate sense of what something is. It's something you do to something else. It's something that you put on to the world that isn't innate. And because it's there as a tool, and that we've developed such an intense boundary around that tool that it seems so inherent, when people put it on you, it's very, very difficult to escape that categorization, as you have sort of naturally fallen into this well of someone thinking that this is your proper place. It's almost impossible to argue yourself out of that position, regardless of how it affects you. And so we have, current legislation on the table in Canada to try to define sentience, to expand the definition of sentience to incorporate animals, but still there's a corporate lobby working against that, because of the implications of what that would mean for our practices. And so, also the definitions of what things are don't necessarily follow even a close reading of what they are, but rather what we have to make them in order to continue to behave the way that we behave towards them. So I'm part of the teaching that I'm trying to share with great difficulty is the way that people around me in my life define people, and it having a much broader and more flexible and in a lot of ways unstable definition that is applied to anything that moves and holds together of its own accord. And in an animate sense of the word, everything is moving, and things that aren't moving are only temporarily not moving. So anything could become a person, anything could, become its own sort of entity in a way, might be an easier way to glom onto it, but anything could become an entity if it starts moving around and affects you. You have to then relate to it, regardless of whether it has a mind, it has a force that is affecting you, and therefore, you know, in my sort of tradition and the things that I've been taught, you treat those in a very pragmatic way. It's not sort of an idealist sense of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice? And it's like, oh, this like nice thing that you do. It's more just like, yeah, that stuff is moving. And so we have to attend to it because it's something that's like happening. I may or may not get through all of this, but and you may or may not have seen my diagrams, but this is like how I think through things, and the sort of thinking of um, this idea of research as ceremony. So Sean Wilson has this book, Research as Ceremony, and sort of thinking about the ceremonies in our lives that transform things into other things, in the craft of like making food. Something becomes food when at one point it was just like a sort of sentient person over there, just like living its life, having a nice time. And then all of a sudden you're like, you look delicious. And so that is like a kind of really intense thing that we do. And we sort of can't escape it at the same time. And even if you want to be a vegetarian, you can't discount the fact that plants communicate. And so there's this inherent nature in our relationships to ourselves that requires us, we're hungry and we have to go it into the world. And whether we're told that something's food or not, you try to eat it. Like it's just, it's part of being an animal. Um, and I guess like there's quite a lot of ritual that helps us to try to become okay with that. And there's a lot of work in this idea of like cannibalism in like indigenous literature, actually. And there's this guy, Jack D. Forbes, who wrote a book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, which is just, it's a very good book. It's very interesting, and it gives a really good overview of the problematic that indigenous people, like not as a monolith, but in a lot of ways just encountering capitalism, understand this sort of consumption of time as like a life, like part of your life, and that it's not abstract, it's really you're living through it. And in people assuming that they have a right to your time are like actually consuming your life. And understanding this as something that is not you don't have a right to that necessarily, but we take that right and it's part of our relationship with others. And I really like this idea of Martin Buber has this idea of the I-thou relationship as opposed to the I-it relationship. So I like this idea of relating to the world as a sort of, populated with other presences, and whether or not it's an object or a person, it's just, it kind of like in an animate sense of things, there isn't that clear definition. It's more like, as I am here always, I myself am defining my relationships, and the words I use are just tools that I'm defining how I'm feeling about this, how I'm determining our alignment with each other. And, in that, I'm creating in a lot of ways the world around me in collaboration with the world that is, as Kevin was saying, creating its own sense of things and putting that back at me. And in being able to have a more complex sense of consent in relation to objects. I think as a craftsperson, it makes a lot of sense if you think about when you're making something of what this material wants to be, as like the material itself doesn't necessarily have desire, but it does have a form, and that form has sort of ways that it is, and that in me touching it and feeling it and developing a relationship with it, I can start to, I guess, have more of this interactive and sensitive relationship with materiality, where I'm really concerned with how things hold together and what their coherence means even for an object. And by consequence, in having the sensitivity towards objects, I myself can learn to take less for granted about the sort of like categories that I reflexively have and place onto other beings in the world. Um, to kind of like, and this is my more understanding of like, um, sort of property relations and the sort of rituals that we have of how we're defining things, as we talk about property as though it's a settled thing, but really it is a relationship that we have too that actually requires an immense amount of effort, a coordinated global effort to maintain. And it is, in fact, incredibly unstable. We have a whole system of law that's entirely, almost entirely working around trying to maintain these property relations. And when I was looking back at where the even top word authority came from, it comes from this figure in auction houses in the ancient world, where they would determine that a trade was going to move forward, and their presence as an authority would make sure that promises that were made would get carried through. So in a lot of ways, it is also a relational thing. Um, Authority, that we confer these authorities with a sense of the future that we determine through the ways that we're categorizing things and the promises we're making. In a lot of ways, categories are themselves promises of these sort of relations, that this, as I categorize somebody as an object, in a way, it's a promise. I'm going to be violent towards you. I'm going to hurt you. I'm promising that by categorizing you in this way. And as a person who's had that happen to them a lot, I can hear that promise now in the way that people start to act towards me, and I can feel it. And it is really scary, and it's not actually personal, and that's part of the problem is that it's not personal, and that it is sort of habitual, and that, I'm sure that I've done it to others too, right? Because it's so baked into the way that we're taught to relate to one another. So I really like to lean into my artistic sensibilities to maintain a sort of openness to the quality of things as potentially suggesting to me new ways to relate to it, as sort of conferring agency onto things and having a more sort of magical perspective on things. Like a lot of people um, don't really understand magical realism as an attempt to describe the way that people really experience the world as magical, that it really does look and appear that way, and it really does show up for some people and some cultures in that way, just because of the way that you construct perception and you respond to the sort of immediacy of the moment that has this transformative quality. Like, again, like Kevin was talking about, in the creative act of deciding what's happening and what things are, um, and having sensitivity to have those things define the way that they are for you. In a way, it's like sensing what a material wants to be is me responding to the quality of what it is and being sensitive to, well, if I try to do this, is it resisting me? Does it have a grain? Is it having some sort of quality that doesn't want to do what I've designed? And so being able to be sort of flexible, I can find out what shape something wants to have in my relationship with it, rather than trying to impose some sort of image of like what I think it should be. And in a lot of ways, like,
We're at time, Io.
okay, so that, just feel, 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 is I think the essential thing that I'm trying to say, is like feel and allow that feeling to well up and become a category unto itself, rather than trying to name it prematurely. Wait and be with it for a minute and see what it wants to become before we decide what it really is. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for those amazing presentations. We still have about 15 minutes for questions, comments, anything that may come up for you. It was I really like those final thoughts there, Io, with um, the whole wanting to really look at everyone and everything as persons and objects, even. I mean, as you say, it's baked into the way in which we engage with the world from I don't know, the us moderns. I keep saying us moderns do this and do that, and we do. And it's a quite expanded way of thinking and doing. So, how do we change us moderns into looking at these perspectives? As I was hearing you, I was also thinking about Latour's action network theory and wondering if you are thinking about that as well, or is Latour is has his work been a bit of an inspiration, or is this something different? Because you're talking about magic, and so that also may contrast there with what Latour was speaking about social systems. But I don't know. That's just my personal musing right now. I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand, but if you have any comments, any questions, I see Chris's hand there. Go for it, Chris.
Hey, hi everyone. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for really interesting presentations, and I'm going to sort of open a question up for anybody, unless there's someone else who has another sharper, more specific question. Something that's on my mind a lot these days is that as academics, we get really good at diagnosis and critique, and I'm always, I've read a lot of sort of like popular social theory books in the last year or two that are like 90% here's the diagnosis and then 10% what do we do with it. And so the question I want to throw back to everybody is what does your analysis imply about like about action, ethics, politics, solidarity, mobilization for the kinds of transformations that you imagine? And I mean, some of you have touched on that already a little bit, I'm curious just to hear more.
Would anyone like to take on this question? Ethics, actions, solidarity, transformation. Ayo, I see you.
I mean,
Go for it.
I have described myself before as persnickety in like situations, so I'm often causing a lot of turmoil. But I think it's positive often, I think, and I don't mean it to be turmoil, but I come from a tradition of I really love this idea of Discordianism, which is like this thing from the 60s and 70s of people who were quite ridiculous. And their kind of move was whenever things started to be too solid or to be too kind of particularly sure, that to just kind of like slightly undermine it all the time, to like kind of just create these little openings for like, hey, is it like is it so sure, are we so sure, and to just sort of have a more, and a lot of my friends are really into clowning right now and
Mm,
really into this sort of like joyful, playful, questioning and proposing a lot of sort of like interpersonal fun ways of opening up
mm,
those spaces of uncertainty as like, this is not scary. It's actually awesome. Like, we could be doing so much, but we have to really experience the difference of like practicing what else could happen, which is, I think, such a challenge because it's frightening to not know where you stand and to not know what's going to happen. And I think in order to really invite that sense of like fun in, we have to be jokey and have to like be light and be able to like joke about really heavy things without
mm,
being afraid. Yeah.
mm. Thank you. Kevin?
So my in building on a bit on what I was saying as well, I think that the way that I think about um, I mean, if the question is what do we do? How do you put concepts into practice? I think at one level, the way that I've thought about these things in general is it's really in the mundane and
Mm,
the everyday spaces that tend to feel mundane, or at least they're framed as such, where there are so many choices that are made. And one of them for me, just if I were to take an example right now, which I think we see a lot in contemporary culture, there's a lot of confrontation around core questions, and even in social justice venues, there's a kind of like when it comes to engaging in change. I think that there's sometimes a kind of polarization. There's a lot of polarization, and one of the things today that I think is sort of it's hard to do, but it's kind of important to do, at least in the way that I'm thinking about social change, is simply embracing coexistence in uncomfortable contexts, and that discomfort is not something that we can sidestep. It's just not possible. And the discomfort is something that when embraced and accepted, and this is a part of it, can also be something that is a very valuable element of the changing process that people undergo. And I think what we end up doing today, and this is another version of that substantialist model, is we end up fixing people. We fix them where we believe they are, and I think that this happens in every this is not just I think that in social justice we see this a lot. We put people in places where we presume them to exist, um, and um, and so there's a kind of lack of openness to what the other, and this makes me think of Levinas as well, and what we owe to the other and those kinds of things.
mm, mm. Thank you. I see Neha's hand raised. I always just to point at the discomfort there that you mentioned, I always say to people, it's not uncomfortable. We're not learning. So maybe there's something there. Neha, would you like to
Yeah,
address the
you
question?
always used to say that to me, Monica, but uh, I think we've been discussing this a lot in like here. How do you embody the ethics of what you're learning in the social justice movement? And what came up a lot for us was complexity, articulation of complexity, and recognizing that there is complexity in situations and people's lives and how you research. So I guess it also connects with what Kevin was saying about polarization and Allison's work as well. Um, but the other thing is that there is someone there's a scholar called White. I think he's indigenous. He's an indigenous scholar. He talks about epistemologies of crisis and epistemologies of coordination, and I find that very helpful in thinking about how we can move away from or reconcile with polarization and at the same time complexities of differences, but also substantialism.
Right, right. Thank you. Allison.
I'm just very direct with my interventions. I'm trying to be a little bit more like Io and do things a little bit more stealthily, but I don't know, maybe it's a personality thing. But just when there are crunchy moments in my workplace, um, I literally move in and I do both a physical and a verbal intervention where I am trying to shift the narrative from blaming the particular pharmacist person in the interaction, and them being pathologized for their either for the situation and creating their responsibility in creating the situation and sort of like, well, no, it's not that actually. But also this general narrative that we have out there for gendered racialized folks where they're responsible for the crunchiness of an interaction, where they're responsible for the discomfort, where if you're ruminating and worrying about something or it's bothering you, that's a you problem. And really, really troubling that and interrogating it and working through it with an individual, both through bald statements as well as interrogation and questioning and um, basically making the situation even more uncomfortable. Um, and then just sort of letting them sit with that. And sometimes it works, and the situation is never resolved, but oftentimes it creates a break. The direct confrontation creates a break in the moment where people are just sort of like, oh, you're asking me to think along a completely different track. And that sometimes is enough to create space for a different kind of dialogue.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much for the answers. I'm seeing the clock and I'm seeing that we have like 5 minutes left in this session, and there's just so many things to explore. One of which I think is that aspect of the agency of the world, right? And how we can embrace that agency. And then another thing, and this maybe just open another whole can of worms that we may not have time to address, but just thinking about it. Right now, there's a huge amount of fear and reactions and ideas about artificial intelligence and what it's going to do to us. And it's so interesting to see as if we knew, and it's this one thing and nobody really knows what that's going to do. But it's like people have these like created ideas of what it's going to do and fear and even action points on what to do about it. And often that's like just, for me, that's a bit of an embrace the uncertainty thing. But we're not really uh, we don't have the tools for that in substantialist ways of knowing and being. And I wonder if, from a radical relational perspective, we'd be more. And that's just an example, AI. But of course, there's a whole bunch of wicked problems in the world, including racism, including forms of violence that are embedded in our systems. Um, So just thinking about that uncertainty and the agency of things, is there anything that anyone would like to comment on or discuss in 3 minutes? Um, Bye, Ayo. Soldan, go for it.
Um, Responding to the letter, perhaps just one quick thought. Um, since AI in the current context is being deployed as part of what the British geographer David Harvey calls time and space compression, it serves to increase or to enhance mastery, not understanding and not creativity. That's my 2 cents on it.
Hmm,
Tentative,
interesting.
uh,
Right.
skeptical,
Sure.
even pessimistic, I would say.
Maybe what I would say, just in like one line, is simply that I think, and this connects with what I was saying, and maybe can't confirm, but it sounded like to me like it connects that in one way we need to relinquish much more of what we believe to be the ways in which the world goes, because we need to be much more responsive to all kinds of forces that are not us, that are not ours. And I think one of the modernist fallacies is that we have this order, this vision, this way of thinking, and in that vision, we just impose and impose and impose, and break and break and break on the way.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be very violent as well. And yeah, interesting. Well, I don't see anyone else. I just see a lot of maybe mind working on what we've dealt with today. Thank you very much, everyone. I will stop the recording now. And